Hello and welcome to the August 2020 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. The Pcrf partners with the National Association of EMS Educators to promote research literacy and advance the science of EMS educational research. Here with the Pcrf Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in medical education. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm here with David Page, and soon to join us will be Dr. Piltoon. The study we're going to be reviewing today, I think you're really going to like this one. This is the Why Content and Cognition Matter, integrating conceptual knowledge to support simulation-based procedural skills transfer. This was published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine in 2019, and this is a study that comes out of Toronto, Canada. So thank you all for joining us today. We're going to begin. We want to remind you that you can use the chat feature on your screen to type in questions or comments, and we can bring those into the conversation as we go. I think this is a subject close to EMS educators' hearts. So if you're out there and you're an educator, or you're even interested in something related to this topic, and you'd like to actually come on live and talk to us about it. Maybe you have some ideas, some research questions, some experience in this matter. Just send the organizer a quick note and we will bring you live into the conversation. Okay, so this paper, not that I'm biased or anything, but is a must read, I think, for EMS and medical educators. If anything, just for the introduction section. It's a really well-written review in the introduction section and an application of evidence-based teaching practices. I mean, they review it in just a couple of paragraphs. The authors point out that when we teach clinical skills and procedural skills, we have a tendency to emphasize high volumes as the pathway to expertise. And I think you can all relate to that. Those of you who also have been implementing the minimum competency matrix in your paramedic program, the manipulative skills, the focus and the emphasis tends to be on the numbers in those little columns. So volume tends to be this kind of path to expertise. And then even popular books out there will say, well, you have to do something 10,000 times in order to become, an expert. But research on instructional design supports things like deliberate practice, spaced practice, things we've talked about in this podcast, interleaving, so combining things together, concepts together. And then also, of course, the importance of retrieval practice, which is test-enhanced learning in the outcomes of the student, in the retention and even the transfer outcomes. But what about the content? What about the why? And what content is included and when you're teaching a procedural skill, and how does that affect your outcome, like retention and knowledge, and then learning transfer? And remember, learning transfer is like the holy grail, right? It's the ability for that person to, on the path of expertise, to apply the skill to a novel circumstance, so a different circumstance. So the conceptual knowledge is what we usually call the why of the skill, and that's really important. So the authors describe examples of the evidence that shows that knowing the why is very important, and they use an example of knowing pathophysiology and basic sciences, the conceptual knowledge, and how that relates to the constellation of signs and symptoms that we learn, the tables of signs and symptoms that match with a certain condition like COPD or something like that. And we consider that procedural knowledge. Knowing the list of signs and symptoms associated with a certain condition is a procedural knowledge, but understanding the pathophysiology associated with that is the conceptual knowledge. Well, there's some research that shows that if you integrate or if you interleave in a cause and effect fashion the pathophysiology as you're learning the procedural knowledge, that improves diagnostic skill retention, but it also improves transfer. So transfer, I think of as being able to troubleshoot in a more complicated situation. So we know that there's evidence for this, for interleaving and long-term outcomes and making causal connections, which they call cognitive integration. So how much cognitive integration, I wonder, are we doing when we're looking at Appendix G and other, lists of skills that have to be done in EMT and paramedic school, and thinking about, okay, do we do this as we're teaching? So the gap that these researchers actually did some preliminary research here. They had, and so this gap that they identified after their preliminary research is how the why content is integrated. So how is it integrated? Is it in sequence? Do they do this background first? Here's the physiology and pathophysiology, then we teach the procedure. How is that integrated in, or do they interleave it in a cause and effect way? And does that make a difference in the outcome? So they already saw preliminary research that having the conceptual knowledge makes a difference, but how they put it into the skill of the procedural, teaching the procedural skill, did that make a difference in the retention and in learning transfer? So their research question, their objective, is really to replicate their previous research, but then to extend it and ask, what is the impact of integrating conceptual knowledge into procedural skills training on the overall retention and then the transfer of learning? Then they ask, what is the mediating role of conceptual knowledge, just in general, regardless of which group that these students are going to be assigned to? And you'll see how this is designed in just a second. What's the mediating role of conceptual knowledge in general in supporting skills retention and transfer? So this is a great little diagram that's in the book, and if you don't see the screen, it's okay, we're going to describe it. But essentially what they did is they used a technique called stratified randomization, which means that they want to account for, and we know randomization means we want to account for making sure that we don't have differences between groups. They did stratified randomization with 66 medical students by study year and by sex at the University of Toronto. These were pre-clerkship medical students that in year 1 or 2 made sure they had no previous lumbar puncture training, because that's the procedure they're going to be looking at, is LPs. And they assigned, through this randomization scheme, 22 students per group. So you can see that in the far left, upper left, that each group was an N of 22. So 22 students in each group. This was, of course, ethics board approved. And then the students themselves did sign a consent form to participate in research. And they knew that they were going to be in research, but they didn't know the difference between the groups. They knew what they were going to be doing. They were going to be viewing a video, and then they were going to be integrating their practice. It was self-regulated, so there was an instructor monitoring but not providing feedback. So that's going to be an important thing later when we talk about this. But none of them were getting the feedback, none of the groups. It was a self-regulated learning. So they were going to be viewing a video, but they didn't know the difference between the groups. They were unaware of what the difference between their groups were. So they had instructional videos, and each segment was different. So you see you have one instructional video that is simply the procedure. So it's a demonstration of how to perform a lumbar puncture. It was using a mannequin that's like a half mannequin, kind of like our chest mannequins, just a half mannequin sitting up on a table. And they viewed the video, and then they had each group actually had 25 minutes to view the video. And that would be the first step. The difference in the videos were, one was a procedural only, and that was a little bit shorter, as you can imagine. It was like 13 minutes, I think, or something like that. The other two were going to be a little longer because they were also adding conceptual knowledge. So the second group would be the conceptual knowledge, which would be A and P. And in the book, they really describe in detail which A and P they actually added, things that were relevant to items in this, what we would consider the skills checklist or the task checklist. So if something was relevant for, and Dave and I were talking about this before, an example for us would be, that if you're doing a pleural decompression and you're going to tell a student to enter on top of the third rib, walk on top of the third rib, we always say, then you would somewhere along the line, they would know that the neurovascular bundle runs on the inferior border of the rib. Now, where you would integrate that knowledge is what makes the two different. Integrating conceptual knowledge either in sequence, so you have the conceptual knowledge first, so maybe you teach the anatomy and physiology of the chest in this case, and in our case. In the case of this study, it was lumbar puncture, so they might have done the anatomy of the spine, and again, related to the procedure. And then the third group was they interleaved, which we've talked about before, integrating the cause and effect concept. So as they're teaching the procedure, they would give the reason for using an appropriate angle. In the article, they talk about 15-degree angle. I don't do lumbar puncture, so I don't know, but going at a 15 degree angle, because this is how the spinous process is angled at 15 degrees. So for us, an example would be, enter at the third intercostal, or at the second intercostal space on top of the third rib, because there's a neurovascular bundle on the inferior border of every rib. So doing that at the same time rather than having the A and P first. So these were the three groups: procedure only, integrated in sequence, integrated for causation. So 22 students assigned for each one. When you report, the students would watch the video. They'd have 25 minutes to view the video. Then they had an hour-long practice, but they also had a laptop with them so they could view the video while they practice. So they could go back, stop, rewind, and they had 1 hour to do this. So they integrated their training with the video. So that was sort of their method of feedback, rather than having an instructor standing there giving them feedback. So I would argue that's a pretty good source of feedback. You can go back and you can, review elements of the video as you're performing the technique. So they practiced for an hour. So that's about an hour and a half or so of this between the procedure, viewing the video, and then practicing the simulation training with the video. Then they stopped and they had a post-test, and this was right after their training. And the post-test was the same simulation that was inside the video. So there was a simulation. It was a healthy person, a rule out multiple sclerosis case, and the dummy was sitting up. And so that's how they performed this. Then 1 week later, they came back in and they did three things. They did, and you can see down at the bottom here, they had a delay of 1 week. They did a retention test, which was the same simulation that was in the simulation training that you see above. So it was this healthy person, rule out MS. So it was a pure retention test. And then they did a transfer test, and the transfer test was a more challenging case. So it was an obese patient with back pain, rule out meningitis, and the patient didn't want to sit up, was very uncomfortable sitting up. So they had to now turn the mannequin on its side and perform this in a new or novel circumstance. So that's the transfer test. And then they followed up the transfer test. So this was in order. We went retention test, then you went transfer test, then right into knowledge tests. And those knowledge tests were twofold. You had one that was on procedural knowledge. These were written tests. And then one on conceptual knowledge. So this was how they designed the study. I thought this was an incredible, meticulous design. Because then when you read into and you look at the study in detail, they talk about how they controlled for bias. What are some of the ways they controlled for bias? So they videotaped all of the simulation training and all of the retention and transfer tests, and they had independent neuro residents. There were 6 of them that went through training on being raters and on using what's called the global rating system. And I think we've talked about that, using a global rating system versus a checklist. We've talked about that a little bit. So they decided to use a global rating system based upon research that said it was better. So they had these 6 neuro residents that were teamed up in twos, and they went through training. They went through a pilot program. They even had to they evaluated their inter-rater reliability before they ever put them into the study. And then they even removed a team from the study and had them go through and switched people to make sure inter-rater reliability was demonstrated prior to putting them in as raters. And like I said, it's a really meticulous study. And then the other thing that they did, which again, it was, I kept writing in the margins, wow, this is like things that Dave always says. So I really thought of you, Dave Page, through this whole study, was they actually did test item analysis from their previous pilot research. They looked at the knowledge tests at the end that they did, the written tests. They itemized and they did what we are familiar with doing in paramedic programs. Accredited paramedic programs have to do test item analysis. They performed item analysis and removed items and changed items and based on validating each of these items. So the results then were that there was no significant difference in procedural knowledge tests between the groups, but there was a significant difference in groups on outcomes on conceptual knowledge tests, with the highest being in the integrated for causation group. So that actually didn't surprise me, that procedural tests at the end, so we're down at the delay in 1 week, way out at the end, and those knowledge tests, procedural tests between the groups, the outcomes were not different, but the conceptual knowledge tests were different, and they were highest for those that had integrated for causation. More importantly, they saw learning transfer was highest in the group for integrated for causation. This mediation model, and I'm about to show you a couple of things that, when I saw these things and I tried to read them and understand them, I thought, where's Remley and Tony when I need them? But this was, these are kind of models that they use to try and determine what were the effects on the outcomes. Was it, by grouping, or was it by just fundamental conceptual knowledge? So the mediation model, though, detected the same thing. So that, again, the procedural knowledge test showed there was no significant difference between the groups. But again, the integrated for causation shows this improvement in the conceptual knowledge that's much, and the integrated in sequence is higher than procedure only. Of course, they didn't get the conceptual knowledge. So the relationship, the other thing that they did was they went independently, and that's these other two tables, which again, these are incredibly complex tables. And if you look at the authors, the list of authors, these are all PhDs. So this is the statistical evaluation here is really a model. They're trying to build a model to look at, well, the relationship between the participants that's independent of their group assignment. So now we're just looking at the impact. And again, this gets at what's the mediating effect of knowing of the concept knowledge or the conceptual knowledge on transfer. And those who had tests at the end of higher conceptual knowledge, independent of the group they were assigned, had higher transfer scores. So not only are we seeing that group assignment mattered, but also that even if they were not in, and we'll go back to the table here, even if they were in any group, if the individual had a higher outcome on the conceptual knowledge, they had higher transfer scores. So, and the transfer, remember, is what we're after. This is how you build expertise, or how you even define it in some ways. So that's the study. And Dave, I got to tell you, I thought of you mostly because
I'm so sorry. Did you get some therapy for that too, or is it just like post-traumatic stress and reprogramming?
because I thought of you.
Yes. It's a horrible image. I really apologize.
Well, it's because you have so many times talked about why, and we've talked about, I actually thought of Bill too, because we talk about educator training
Even worse.
so
Even worse.
much. The idea of how we teach the skill. We talk about manipulatives and repetitions, and again, we look at, I should have put a copy of Appendix G in here, but I'm not trying to pick at the COA. You and I are both site visitors, so I'm not trying to pick at things, but it's how we interpret that. I think that's a real
Right,
important
right.
message out there, is looking at that daunting table and saying, oh my God, if my student doesn't have the number 10 in that column for adult intubation, then they're not going to be meeting the minimum competency. And maybe what we really should be doing as educators now, adding to this, is how are we teaching these skills and this, this checklist, with this checklist ahead of us. And this study is actually supporting the interleaving that we've always talked about, but doing it in the procedural skill.
Right.
So,
We've deconstructed, I think educationally, we've deconstructed the entire experience of learning to, we need to split it all into little tiny parts, which, I think microlearning is really important. So tiny digestible parts are important, don't get me wrong, but I think the way that we have separated procedure or the quote motor skill from the psycho part of the motor skill, as Bill Brown would say, that psycho part of knowing when to, when not to, when to try, when to keep trying, when to stop, and but also the part that says the why are you doing this, what's the and so just as they did in their introduction, the concept of test enhanced learning, mixed practice, spaced practice. You're so dead on about this should be required reading in any Instructor 101 course, because they have really synthesized a series of things that are kind of known now to the simulation and education world, but we tend to continue to do madness. We have this, the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting different
yes.
results. We continue to have recitation of a checklist procedure, and that we think translates to some sort of outcome of competency. And I think it's worth mentioning here in terms of methods. One of the constant, there are two phenomenal pieces to this in terms of its methods. One is they used video, which in the middle of COVID now, every one of us needs to be thinking, is watching a video procedure actually teaching him anything, because people want to be live in person demonstrating the skill, which honestly, at this point, I think people should be asking themselves, videotape yourself, see how many errors you make live, standing there explaining a procedure. And then soon you'll realize, gosh, it's probably better to record it once well. And then again, if you're interleaving like this video study is showing, you're not just going, put this here, then do this, but you're explaining the reasons why. And I think, I still think in the sandwich method that NAMSC has always promoted in their 101 courses is great. Whole part whole, you do the whole thing once real time, and then you break it down. And having educators on this call, on this webinar that can think, well, I could do a study on that. I can do a whole part whole video piece on not on a lumbar puncture, which is what this was for, on medical trainees, but on paramedic students, that then translates to an in-person simulation evaluation. The other thing I love about these methods is that they really explain, and I think it's lost on us. We've missed this. So really pay attention. Like I missed this. I'm telling myself, pay attention. This global rating scale,
Yes.
and it is different than our checklists. And in fact, there's science. They actually quote one study, but I'm going to bring up another one. So they're, it's in their references. They want to point to the fact that global rating scales are better than the normal checklist, the procedural checklist that we do in simulation-based assessment. It was a study by Ilgen in 2015 that was a systematic review. And for people who are not familiar with that term, They essentially took and accumulated all of the evidence around this, boiled it down to the strongest evidence. What is it telling us? And global rating scales won. So now I'll take you to a very bright paramedic educator and scientist, Dr. Walter Tavares, who published in 2013, January-March PEC, volume 17, a paper, a beautiful paper on global rating scales being superior for assessment of clinical competence in initial paramedic education. So Tavares, Boet, Rob Terrio was on that paper, a good friend and member of NEMSI. And in this paper, they're able to articulate a global rating scale that was validated and can be used by all of us. So it's just right there, in which they're breaking down a paramedic, not a medical student doing lumbar puncture, but a paramedic's ability to manage a simulation or manage a case, which frankly I think works in the field as well. And so I think as you said, they have incorporated so many different aspects of good educational practice in this study, just in the design, to get rid of some of the noise, some of the uncertainty about how valid the study would be, because they're using a previously validated methodology that's up to date. And they're not going to use a flawed exam or a flawed checklist. They're going, you know what, this actually, if we're going to evaluate a simulation, we're going to use a global rating scale. If we're going to interleave, we're going to actually do it in a test and spaced manner. So again, love their section on contextual variations, because we of course have mega contextual variations in education and EMS. You have to not just think, okay, I can do this on a table. Goodness, I hope no one is teaching anyone to do skills on a table anymore. The learning transfer from one environment to the other, but contextualizing it to, you're going to do this on the floor, inside, outside, in a car, or wherever these particular types of skills are being done. And love this part on timely feedback. So we can't. I think that there's a very poor understanding of how that works. And in some cases, people think, oh, in 30 minutes or an hour after the simulation, I'm going to explain that 30 minutes ago you made an error. Whereas the immediacy of the brain picking up on, oops, that didn't work, I need to do it differently. That's it's all kind of weaved into the method. So I can't wait for you to report all the results too. But it is I think phenomenal, and I love that they're so detailed. So.
Yeah, and I think you make so many good points in there. And they actually acknowledge in their limitations section, that this is, there were certain things that they would have done different. They did do a lot of controlling though for bias, which I thought was, and they described it to an extremely detailed degree. I was so impressed at how they treated their raters. I mean, these are, they had the 6 raters, and they said, we're not just going to stick them in and say they're neurology residents and they'll know. They actually went through training. They made them train on being a rater and using the global rating scale, and then they made them go through a pilot of reviewing videos in teams to see what their inter-rater reliability was. They pulled a team because their inter-rater reliability was terrible, and they said, okay, we're going to switch up, we're going to train again. I mean, I was so impressed. And then when they said they did test item analysis too, so not only are they designing this really well, they're validating the tools that they're going to use. Like you said, they're using things that are evidence-based all the way along. So it wasn't, the methods on this one was just really dynamic, and the background there. I do have some questions about how much we can apply this to EMS. And one of them makes me think of Bill. I don't know if Bill's on yet, but like I said, Bill's always talking about how are we preparing our educators. And there's a few things you were saying, Dave, about, we've got to get away from this sort of recitation of, and I always call it narration. I always tell students, stop narrating and talk to your team. If they're talking to their team, I know what they're thinking. They don't have to say BSI and scene safety if they're wearing BSI and they're looking for things. If we plant unsafe things on the scene and they actually find them, then that's scene safety. I always say it doesn't exonerate you from checking scene safety by walking in and saying, I'm checking for scene safety.
Well, yeah, it's the, and I think the global rating scale accounts for situational awareness,
Yes.
which again was something that we wanted to make sure we infused with culture of safety and career research management. And so it is a again contextual evolving situation. And if you don't have a situation to be aware of, then you can't measure the things you're measuring. So I do love the attention to detail here. Is so much can be packed into such a small little set of words that makes you think, wow, these people were really thinking ahead.
Yes. And, I have written here too, this needs to start in EMT. And, people can email me and yell at me for saying this, but it really bothers me when your students come into paramedic and you start running simulations very early. And the first thing they do is say BSI and scene safety on every single call. And I know that, I'm going to get hate mail for saying this, but we shouldn't be encouraging them to narrate their call. They need to run their simulation. They need to suspend disbelief. We need to create an environment where they can suspend disbelief and act like it, so that we stop hearing things like, oh, well, this is different. This is different. National Registry is different than this, is different than that's textbook and National Registry, it's different than the field. I keep saying to them, the first time
Hate that. Just
you
hate it.
fly in space is when you fly in space. And the only thing you can do is simulate it. So guess what? The only thing we can do here is simulate, especially right now, maybe for some people with COVID, like you said. But this stuff can't start in paramedic. It has to start in EMT. We have to stop doing this recitation of skills and have them learn early on, because it has been just burrowed into their brains when they get to paramedic school, that they are narrating like a third person when they walk into a scene. And we really, I like I said, I know I'm probably gonna get hate mail for that, but I really, it bothers me, and it's reinforced over and over again. It just keeps going, because when the student goes to another instructor, they say, well, you didn't say scene safety, so I'm marking you down. Or,
Right.
or you didn't, and then they go and they get a job. And when they get a job, sometimes their job training does the same thing. Well, we ran them through skills and they didn't say BSI and scene safety. Like, oh my God, when is this going to end? It's going to follow us all the way through. This reinforcement of this practice.
Yeah.
The other thing I have written here too is, that the authors make these great comments to educators. And they say, there's implications for educators. I think it's funny because they say educators who want to design education that promotes transfer of learning. Well, I hope everybody wants to design something that promotes transfer of learning,
Not
but
really. We just
not
want to
really.
teach and have them all forget what we did.
Yeah. But they say, number one, you need to consider the trainee's level of conceptual knowledge, and that's something that we think about. What do they come with? What does each person come with? And then number two, the content that you choose to teach matters. And it should include conceptual knowledge that explains the why of what they're doing. Now, one of the issues I have there is, do our educators know the correct conceptual knowledge? Do they know do we have, and again, this comes to us doing more research in education, us forming a network of, of researchers around the country at different, we have places like UCLA and others around that have done, and Creighton and others that have been pilots for National Registry and for other things and for the COA. can we form a network of hubs of education centers that can feed
Oh,
data
you are just
into?
seeding, you're just seeing my tune. I just can't even I can't hold it back. I'm so excited because I've been wanting to do this for years, and I hope people that are listening go, okay, but let's just do it. Because
Yes, I know.
Utstein and the CARES database for cardiac arrest was something that was really just a concept of, let's just keep track of the same crap, a bit, sorry
Yes.
for the conflict, I'll declare full conflict, but FISDAP was the same way. Let's just measure stuff. Let's start tracking it so that we know if we're improving. If we're not measuring it, then we'll never know if it changes or improves or not. And
Yeah.
then and this concept that kind of overall educationally, we even Utstein, just by or CARES now, just by the fact that it asks you the question, did you have bystander CPR started? Was there an AED available? Makes you think in your community, oh, geez, I think probably people should know how to do CPR. Probably we should have AEDs somewhere. And it causes a process internally to go, we're not doing best practices because we're not integrating these things.
Yes.
The CGME, the graduate medical education folks did a toolbox of evidence-based tools for education. One of them, for example, in important things like how do you teach empathy, and then they listed the best evidence here that we've found based on all these studies is that you have standardized patients, and that there's this great tool from Rochester that you can see how empathy is measured, et cetera. It's another global rating scale. And so you have these best practices where you'd want to say, did you get patient feedback from every one of your simulations? And yet, if we don't have this communal kind of brain trust of these are best practices, we get lost in the alphabet soup of did COA, NR, NA, NE, EMS, whatever said we needed to do this. And in the end, educators are so taxed with so much to teach in so little time, and with so few tools, it often just feels like, well, I'm just struggling to actually, deliver what the content. So some of
Without
us,
questioning whether
yeah,
we should be teaching some of the content to begin with, or
right,
whether some
right.
content is more important than others. And again, that's where research comes in. Do we even know which conceptual knowledge is important to integrate? We do know, and this is the third point they make to educators, is how we expose the relationships between the how and the why content matters. So interleaving, once again, here comes interleaving to the top of the the podium, saying we should be interleaving through cause and effect models as we're teaching skills. But which ones, which conceptual knowledge matters? And I think that's a great place to start. And then do our educators know the conceptual knowledge to begin with? And
Oh, I'm going to
I
go back
started.
to the future.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to a book that
Yeah, the
uh,
why.
that Marty Breiter wrote back in I believe it was the 80s. She's going to kill me
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to date her, but I hope she never hears this podcast because it'll be embarrassing. Debbie Kaysen did one too. It was an assessment-based paramedic textbook. So
Mm-hmm.
that like problem-based learning, like so many things, the patient doesn't read the textbook, present with the signs and symptoms. It's not an automation kind of thing, but it was about, here's somebody who's complaining of trouble breathing, and then now let's based on that, on your assessment findings, understand the why of the mechanics and the reasons why all these things could manifest into this result. And it is that interleaving and that strength. We just seem to be enamored in this educational violent, that's what I call it, like domestic violence. We just repeat the cycle of learning and abuse that we think, okay, no, we are going to talk about this disease. You're going to learn everything about this disease. And then we're going to stop and we're going to learn about this other disease. And
Yes.
never do our synapses, our neurons and dendrites connect one thing to the other and go, yeah, the diabetic has a heart attack because they have poor vascular and vascular disease is a problem for both. So I'm sure Bill, who's now on and unmuted, will slaughter me here shortly, but I'd like to throw the entire educational model up and say it's time for problem-based learning. It's time for the Mckenna concept maps that she did an amazing presentation of about 10 years ago at an NMC conference. And we just don't seem to pick up on these real standards and advances. It's like we're still, if we were to compare this to clinical care, we're still, teaching CPR by raising people's arms and thinking that that circulates blood.
Yeah. Bill, are you on here?
I thought that would goat Bill because it's resuscitation research.
Can you hear me or not?
Yeah, I
can
hear you now. I'm so sorry we can hear you too.
Can you hear me?
We gotcha.
Okay. Dave, I agree with you 100%. It is more than time. And the people, though, that need the tools are the educators. And they need to be educated to be educators. We take it still too much for granted that just because someone's, again, it's the same thing they always, someone becomes a great paramedic, so they automatically think they can be a great educator or they can be a great supervisor. You can't become those without being properly developed. And I do think
or have a back injury or
yeah. Well, no, and that's people end up depending on the we can do this with you and stuff and to keep you working, and I mean that's very noble and nice, but it doesn't necessarily mean the right person's in the right job for the right reason. And then if you look at, let's forget salaries that they pay for paramedics. When you look at salaries of educators, particularly EMS educators within the college environment, they're not compensated equivalently to other educators. And why would I want to go into education for a college when I can make more money just taking care of patients?
And they're not even in actual departments. They're often, they're a continuing education / 40-hour a week model of you're a teacher, but you know what? We don't grant educational credit here because even though it's a university, this is through the extension program or through the hospital or through the, it doesn't translate to an academic appointment where you're able to actually continue to develop the profession and yourself, and that's
the shortcoming of the Carnegie credit.
Right. Well,
it's also, I think too, it plays into the same question that we have about the field, right? What preparation are we requiring of our educators before they come in? Just like what preparation are we requiring of our practitioners before they go out in the field? This gets into, dare I say it, the whole degree debate. And the same goes for, what do you need to become an educator of EMS, but which comes first, the pay or the degree? It's the same kind of argument, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, but I'm going to go back to another thing that Dave, because I know we're going to run out of time here, particularly with us all talking. I think your idea of the network, and I think you're right. We just need to do it. We need to find a couple of institutions. If it's only 2, we start with 2. If someone wants to get into it, but look at the Pcrf network that they do for pediatric emergency and how they started that, let alone that they produce a lot of great stuff that comes out of that. And if I could ever get the 2 of you to come to the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, you would hear a lot of this kind of discussion that goes on.
Not that again.
Yes. Because you're missing out on you're taking your stuff and seeing some of the things that I think we've struggled through even in EMS that could be beneficial for them, but there's stuff they do that would be extremely beneficial for us. And the creativity is phenomenal with that, but the passion, you would find it within that group of people, and they're also frustrated they're not given enough teaching time. They've got to do too much clinical time. I mean, the stories are very interesting, and there's not enough time to teach everything they want us to teach, and it's very interesting.
Part of the break here, if I can even go so far as to say, is that we've constructed a system that's based on either community college or extension service that doesn't. It has capped hours, and we cram large amounts of hours into credits that then kind of shortchange the student for the degree, shortchange the profession for people, for, you know, acknowledging the quality of their education, but it shortchanges the instructors because they're teaching way more with way less revenue or income or way to do it. But, you know, I mean, we got off into a tangent here about this, but I think absolutely the incorporation of every single one of these best practices into this paper clearly shows that interweaving, interleaving, and repeated test-based assessment, you know, critical thinking piece is key, and I think that's in their results, clear as day. It's that ability to think critically is what we're after.
And that is going to give us practitioners that have the ability to go out and continue to learn on their own and continue to mature and develop and be thinking, critically appraising things. We'll grow. We will grow at leaps and bounds, and then there'll be nothing that we can't do. But we're limited now by the educational models that we've used.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Well, you know, this also feeds into when you're talking about, and by the way, Bill, your SAM is every May, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And I wonder if they'll go virtual this year, if we'll have an actual in-person.
We went virtual this past May. We did for 2021. I'm on the program committee and have been for a number of years, and we're planning again.
Now I know why you want me over there.
That's right. We're planning to go live, but again, what's happening now, and I'll just weave into this quickly, is hospitals are looking critically at, can they let people travel at all still? Should they budget it? I mean, it's amazing. So right now we're hoping for 2021, but we'll see. And it's supposed to be in Atlanta this year.
Atlanta, okay.
Yeah.
You know, what you were talking about though too, about having, you know, that other groups like the medical educators and medical researchers having the same issues as we do, and I'm sure it goes, you know, for nursing and other fields. The first thing I thought of was we cannot seem to get interprofessional education down either, and collaborative practice, and also I would say interprofessional research. You know, that's in this whole idea of interprofessional education. I think Mike Miller has some knowledge base there and some experience there, and I'm talking about more than we did a practice simulation with the nursing program once a year, or with, you know, we combined residents and 3 other programs, you know, once a semester or something. I'm talking about true interprofessional work with other programs. So I haven't seen great examples of that in research either. So I think we may have had a study that we've looked at that had, and I always look at the list of authors, where you have a nice interdisciplinary group of authors. That always, you know, warms my heart. But we really don't see this in education crossing over. So this is the reason I keep pulling articles from other aspects of medical education that seem to have it down a little bit more than we do in EMS. But I do think there's implications for interprofessional education and collaborative practice here too.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. One of the things I've been trying to promote, and I'm still in my infancy with the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, I'm trying to get all these academic programs that when they're, you know, during your residency program, you're required to do research. And there's a lot of EMS research that's done because these people are former EMS providers themselves that have gone on to become emergency room physicians. I says, why aren't we tacking a paramedic or two on to these groups? That not saying, well, I was a paramedic and I still am, and I'm a physician now. No. I want you to be teaching these research principles and having them there as an author in the group, reaching out to their local services or educational institutions to get them to get involved in that. And that's another way to, you know, real hands-on research experience.
Yeah, completely agree. So I think the results, one of the things that they, just to get back to the study for just a second here, one of the things that they point out is they had a mediated, what they call it, mediated by the positive impact on conceptual knowledge. They had both groups that were in the integrated instruction group, integrating conceptual knowledge with procedural knowledge, had better skills transfer, but not skill retention. So at first I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would they not have better skill retention? And again, they were repeating the same skill, so maybe procedural knowledge was fine for that. But they also made a comment in here later that they felt that result in this study, which was different from their first study, that retention actually did improve with conceptual knowledge integrated, that had to do with the way that they sequenced their test enhanced learning, that they didn't have a retention test immediately after, and they felt that that wasn't a best practice. We've seen this before in education research, where you want to do research and you want to control for all factors, but you also want to practice evidence-based education. And we know that timely feedback, like David mentioned, is associated with improved outcomes. And even though they didn't have a live person, I would argue that the video, having the video back and forth, that could be considered feedback as they're learning the skill. But they didn't have the benefit of test enhanced learning, and that's what they had pointed out in the results and in the discussion section and in the limitation. They said that they really felt that the reason they didn't see that might have been because they didn't see that the benefit of getting that, depriving them, that was what they said, the benefits of test enhanced learning. So they knew there was a practice in there that wasn't, that was kind of overlooked here. So I thought that was an interesting point if you're doing educational research, because I think we've seen this before in whether or not to study something in a static environment, but knowing that providing feedback is really important for learning outcomes, saying, well, actually, we need to provide some type of feedback in order to see and equally across the board. That's why I actually like the model of the video instead of a person, because you can't, that introduces bias to know what kind of feedback, and each student's going to need a different type of feedback. So I thought that did away with some of their bias, but this is just a really well written study, I thought, and they considered so many things. So I think one of the points too I wanted to make, and I wanted to ask Dave and Bill what you think of this. So we talk about having this network, and one of the things that we could do is to examine the EMT and paramedic skills, and maybe pick, score which ones would be sort of the ones that we would bring to the forefront to study, and identify which points in those skills checklists, if we're going to use those checklists to start with, and are essential to have some degree of conceptual knowledge integrated. So I think probably a good place to start is to look at the critical fail criteria at the bottom and say, well, if we're going to fail on it, there must be something here that's important to understand. So, which areas are important? Because not only do I worry about, educators not knowing, the correct conceptual knowledge, but which ones will matter, which elements matter, and which ones are frivolous or not important.
That's where you're really cooking with gas. I think that's where the rubber hits the road. We I think have just so many things that we track that don't matter. So you need to begin to say, these are the parts that really, really make a difference. And like aviation, and I know keep going back to that, but crew resource management is key. The concept of the skill checklist has to morph, and we have to get into what are the essence, what are the essential pieces in this overall practice of paramedicine that make for good outcomes. And then and then in each one of those begin to say, okay, out of these things, when a windshield is cracked in an aircraft at 10,000 or 100,000 feet or whatever, 10,000 feet, you need to drop down to 1,000 feet. That is a critical fail, right? If that happens, where, you know, the aircraft, you know, will decompress, we could die. And then craft those global rating scales based on the essential outcome-based, evidence-based elements of our practice. And I think the trouble we have is, we haven't linked to outcomes very well, especially education to outcomes. Meaning, you know, we may have now known that aspirin really helps with MIs, and surely it must be given. Reading an EKG and identifying the STEMI so that you can get to the cath lab is another one of those, gosh, you need to know that. But how did we teach the students to read the STEMI, or which, you know, what would that look like for them to be able to have better outcomes? And I think student outcomes and patient outcomes have to be linked, and we're poised to be able to do it. You know, there's companies like ESO, and I don't have any personal conflict there. They support research so much that I feel conflicted, because they're great, but they're connecting charts to outcomes. And if you can connect charts to individuals and their abilities, then slowly we see a model of competency or continued competency that could look very different than these concepts of rehashing the same material you're always hashing. Again, needing, like you said, to really break down what matters. You know, Utstein changed over time, and so will the data that we capture, because we will find that some things matter and some things didn't. But you know, the simplicity of just give me the facts, tell me what really works, and combining that with how do we, particularly because we're wrapping up and this is about this study, how do we take all those best practices and then begin to really identify the whys? And I think we're stronger together than when we are apart. I don't think it's really a good practice to have educators in every program nationwide trying to create their own version of what the global rating scale is for their students, trying to create their particular version of how to interleave the skill of endotracheal intubation, chest decompression, putting on a splint if you're talking about the basic level. And it's really that we're too stuck on potato, like stuff that doesn't matter. It's the principles of what happens when you put on the splint and why the splint is or isn't important. That's, I think, where the rubber hits the road, and doing that kind of work as a profession might really change fundamentally how we teach.
And I think with 2 minutes left, I'll open a major can of worms. How does this apply to our preceptors as well in the clinical setting? So, you know, again, you're getting at sort of depth and breadth, which is in the EMS education standards. A good time to revisit these, actually, and since that they're being revisited right now. But how deep does this need to go, and which element, like you said? When people are on their internship, you know, when you see this variability between preceptors, when one says they don't know acid-base balance, you know, lab values that are critical for something, and another person says, no, I just want them to know X, Y, and Z. So yeah, there's so many aspects to this, but
well, and you're absolutely right, but aren't we, maybe I'm mistaken, but I don't even think that's a can of worms, because preceptors are educators. It's just that we never treat them as such.
That's right.
So a modularized approach to our professional development when it comes to, you might be a teacher in the field, you might be a teacher in a lab, you might be a teacher that's coordinating experiences, whether it's simulation or actually clinicals. this is facilitated learning. And the trouble we have is that we keep thinking the teacher is providing information. And instead of facilitating the learning and evaluation and potentiating the concept of learning and retention. So 100% agree that a concept of facilitation of learning and micro facilitation or facilitation of micro learning, would be at the core of what a future instructor looks like, and not necessarily that the person who can stand and deliver or reconstruct or create checklists for every skill. I doubt that every aviation instructor is learning how to create checklists. They are actually using, well-developed, very specific checklists that the profession helped them, that matter.
Mm-hmm. So we're at the top of the hour, and any final comments?
You continue to do a very good job of finding topics that are important, and as you say, cross-discipline, from other disciplines to discuss with us that in paramedicine. But I think one of the things two things today that really come to my mind is we probably do need to be doing more interdisciplinary education with nursing, physicians, PAs, advanced nurse practitioners, to really see where our common grounds are and the lessons learned. And then to go back to Dave's thing is, I think that we need to have this greater collaborative effort so people understand what that principle is, so we can really focus on the principle of best practices that will have to change as knowledge and technology changes, so they can't be stagnant. They can't fall into this practice that we're in right now. I saw the comment about someone, we haven't even talked about continuing education, which I find to be the bane of people's existence in many ways, because it's beating dead horses again over and over and expecting a different outcome, that definition of insanity. So very good, Meg. Thank you. And Dave, as always, and the authors.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Greg, for making that comment too. Thank you all for joining us for this great discussion. We will be back September 25th for the Pcrf Education Research Podcast at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. But don't forget, we also have the Pcrf Clinical Podcast, which is Monday, September 14th, also at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. If you'd like to present an upcoming article or maybe participate in the presentation, you can email David Page at dpage@emsed.net. Thank you all for joining us.